We must recognize that we live in an ever closer hemisphere with mutual responsibilities. Trade and tourism of the United States and Canada, for instance, are increasingly connected with all of Latin America and the Caribbean, as the sub-regions of this hemisphere are forging closer economic ties with each other. We are also connected by the scourge of crime, which is a two-way street. Drug demand in the United States fuels drug production among our neighbors, undermining the ability of democratic institutions to enforce the rule of law either here or in our neighboring countries. And the easy availability of small arms from the United States has made crime an increasingly serious problem for governments in the Caribbean and Central America. Globally, in a way I hate to say this, globally, Americans in my country give just 15 cents for $100 of national income in official development assistance. As a share of our economy, we rank dead last among the industrialized countries. The recently announced Millennium Challenge account, a very exciting program, is designed to provide additional help for governments pursuing transparency and accountability. But in this hemisphere, only 3 countries, Bolivia, Honduras, and Nicaragua, are even being considered for this aid. The United States has another role to play as well, of setting an example of protecting civil liberties and improving democratic practices at home, and by its unwavering support of democracy and human rights abroad. The international lending agencies also have important roles to play by being more flexible and more responsive to political pressures and social constraints within countries when deciding conditionality. By involving local citizens and governments in developing consensus for poverty reduction strategies, and by helping the hemisphere carry out the carefully considered mandate adopted by presidents at the periodic summits of the Americas. Finally, I call on all governments of the hemisphere to make the Democratic Charter more than empty pieces of paper, to make it a living document. The Charter commits us to help one another whenever our democratic institutions are threatened. The Charter can be a punitive instrument, providing for sanctions when a serious challenge to the democratic order does occur. But it's also an instrument for providing technical assistance and moral encouragement or persuasion to prevent democratic erosion early in the game, before a crisis erupts. Let us strengthen the Charter and not be afraid to use it. Right now the Charter is weak because it is vague in defining conditions that would constitute a violation of the Charter. The so-called, quote, unconstitutional alteration or interruption of the democratic order is noted in Article 19. The Charter also requires the consent of the affected government, even to evaluate a threat to democracy. If the government itself is threatening the minimum conditions of democracy, the hemisphere is not prepared to act, since that would certainly not be an invitation from the abusive government itself. 2 simple actions would help to remedy this problem and allow the governments of this hemisphere to act when needed. First, a clear definition of what is meant by, quote, unconstitutional alteration or interruption. This would guide us. These conditions should include, in my opinion, first, a violation of the integrity of central institutions, including constitutional checks and balances, providing for the separation of powers. That's so that, obviously, a president cannot dominate the legislature or the judiciary or the election commission, and so that the legislature, with a supermajority, cannot dominate or take away the powers unconstitutionally of a president. Second, the holding of elections that do not meet minimal international standards. And those standards are being very carefully defined among all of us, including the Carter Center, who participate as international observers. Third, failure to hold periodic elections or to respect the outcome of an election once it's held. Fourth, systematic violation of basic freedoms, including the freedom of expression, freedom of association, or respect for minority rights. Fifth, unconstitutional termination of the tenure in office of any legally elected official. Sixth, arbitrary or illegal removal or interference in the appointment or deliberation of members of the judiciary or electoral body. Seventh, interference by non-elected officials, such as military officers, in the jurisdiction of elected officials. And finally, number 8, systematic use of public office to silence, harass, or disrupt the normal and legal activities of members of the political opposition, the press, or civil society. All of those are threats to democracy itself. And with some modification, after you debate those wordings, they might be the definition of what is meant by the interference in democracy. They need to be carefully spelled out. We also need a set of graduated, automatic responses to help us overcome the inertia and the paralysis of political will that results from uncertain standards and the need to reach a consensus on each alleged de novo or new violation. It's very difficult for this council or any other to take a brand new allegation that hasn't been defined in advance, decide, first of all, is it an allegation that's worthy of consideration, or what actions would be possible if we find it to be legitimate. It should be removed from that sort of preliminary discussion and defined in advance. When a democratic threat is identified, the alleged offenders will be requested to explain their actions. That's all. Just explain their actions before the permanent council. A full evaluation of follows, and possible responses should be chosen from a prescribed menu of appropriate options, involving not only the Organization of American States, but incentives and disincentives for multilateral institutions and the private sector. There's also a role for non-governmental leaders. We at the Carter Center have convened a group of former hemispheric presidents, leaders, presidents, and prime ministers to aid in raising the visibility of this charter, to engage the Organization of American States, and to help them provide appropriate responses when democracy is challenged. Now, for almost 20 years, we have had at the Carter Center a council of freely elected heads of government, prime ministers and presidents, elected democratically, who volunteered to work with us to address crises throughout the hemisphere. Troubled elections, hyperinflation, things of that kind. All human rights abuses. We now have 32 members of this council, very active, very eager to be of assistance. They're now out of office, like I am, but still have a statesmanship and some work to add and can be called upon to help when appropriate. Let me close my remarks by congratulating the Organization of American States. We've come a long way from our first association with it 30 years ago. As a promoter of freedom, democracy, and human rights, the OAS is one of the foremost regional organizations in the world. This hemisphere adopted the world's first anti-corruption convention and has developed a multilateral evaluation mechanism on drugs. The Organization of American States has worked on demining, on peacekeeping, and providing scholarships to students and many other issues of importance to human beings. It exemplifies the notion